Hello everyone, I'm Nitsuhone, and it is Dominaria Limited Review Week right now on my channel. I've looked at all of the cards in white, blue, and black, and today we're looking at red. If you want to see how I grade cards in these videos, you can find a link in the description below to a video that explains the grading system. Now let's get started. First up, we have Bloodstone Goblin, which for 1 generic and 1 red is a 2/2 Goblin Warrior at common. And whenever you cast a spell, if that spell was kicked, Bloodstone Goblin gets +1/+1 and gains Menace until end of turn. Bloodstone Goblin is nice because he benefits from two things. He's a payoff for having a lot of kicker in your deck, and for the most part, the cards with kicker in this set are just good anyway, so you're going to happen to have a lot of it, and red actually has a ton of it, as we're going to see. And he's also a goblin, and that might matter a bit in this format, but a little more on that later. So while he is something of a build-around, he can fit into two sort of different kinds of decks, and his fail case is still a 2-mana 2/2, and most of your red decks are going to have enough kicker that he's occasionally going to be a 3/3 with Menace. But if your deck is really heavy with kicker, and maybe with some goblin stuff, he gets to be a little bit better. So he's like a C- in a limited deck that has like, 3 or 4 cards with kicker, which is probably what you're going to have on average, if you're drafting red anyway, and a C+ in a deck with a lot of kicker. Next, we have Champion of the Flame, which for 1 generic and 1 red is a 1/1 human warrior at uncommon. He has Trample, and he says, Champion of the Flame gets +2/+2 for each aura and equipment attached to it. This guy is a build-around, obviously enough. A 2-mana 1/1 with Trample is horrendous in your typical limited deck, so let's just say he's an F in your average limited deck in this format. However, he's going to be great in a deck with equipment and auras, meaning his most frequent home will be red-white, where we have the most payoffs for that. In a deck with a decent number of those things, let's say 5-ish, he gets better, and if you can manage to get like 7 into your deck, you will pretty consistently be able to slap something on him that makes him huge. I think he's a nice payoff for those decks, but I would definitely not advise taking him until it looks like that's where you're going to end up, because his floor is terrible, and I think he's at least a C+, and he may even go higher in an equipment or aura-heavy deck. Next, we have Fervent Strike, which for 1 red mana is an instant at common, and it says target creature gets +1/+0 and gains first strike and haste until end of turn. This is a strictly better Kindled Fury, and Kindled Fury has been decent in multiple limited formats. Adding haste to a creature is nice, though obviously if you use it for the haste, it is going to be less of a combat trick because your opponent knows it's coming, but that's fine. Sometimes that will be the best thing to do with it, and that's a nice upside that it has. It can be a combat trick, or you can use it to give your guy haste. It also doesn't hurt that it is in red. Blue-red is especially interested in casting cheap spells, and this fits the bill. Aggressive decks are also going to be happy to run this. I think this is a trick your typical red deck feels fine about running one of, but you probably don't go beyond that. I'm going to give it a C-. Next, we have Fiery Intervention, which for 4 generic and a red is a common sorcery, and it says choose one. Fiery Intervention deals 5 damage to target creature, or destroy target artifact. This is clunky, but flexible removal. 5 mana for 5 damage is decent, and having the ability to also blow up an artifact, of which there are a significant number in this format, is nice too. It doesn't do either thing efficiently, but the fact it can do them both is nice. I think it's a C+. Every red deck feels good about the first one, and maybe even a second one, but you probably want more efficient removal in your deck beyond that. Speaking of more efficient removal, we have Fight with Fire next, which is 2 generic and a red for an uncommon sorcery. It has Kicker for 5 generic and a red, and remember that's an additional cost you can pay for a spell, and if you do, you get a certain bonus of some kind. Fight with Fire deals 5 damage to target creature. If the spell was kicked, it deals 10 damage, divided as you choose among any number of targets instead. This is some removal spell. 3 mana to do 5 to something is excellent, and sure, it's sorcery speed, but the amount of damage for the mana is great and limited. If that's all this card was, it would probably be a B- or so as red's premium removal spell at lower rarity. But, oh yeah, in the late game it can be completely ridiculous thanks to Kicker, and kill several of your opponent's creatures, or just kill your opponent. I think that extra bonus pushes this all the way up to a B, maybe even a B+, making it one of the best commons or uncommons in the set, and one you'll be first picking and playing as many copies of as you can get your hands on. Next, we have Fire Elemental, which for 3 generic and 2 red is a 5/4 elemental at common. And that's it. It's an old school vanilla card. It's cool to see it reprinted. It's one of Magic's oldest cards. But a 5 mana 5/4 isn't especially good on the vanilla test these days, and it really doesn't offer you anything else. If you're desperate for a creature that can keep rumbling into the late game in your red deck, or one that can trade with big creatures, you might end up wanting to play him, but most of the time I think you cut him, and he's a D+. Next, we have Fire Fist Adept, which for 4 generic and a red is a 3/3 human wizard at uncommon. When it enters the battlefield, it deals X damage to target creature an opponent controls, where X is the number of wizards you control. So on its own, this is a 5 mana 3/3 that does 1 damage to a creature your opponent controls. That's not good, but not terrible. And your average red deck, even without trying, will probably have at least a few wizards in it, but if you don't have a lot of them, this is probably something like a D. It's not going to be very good if you have like 3 wizards in your deck, but it'll be okay. Sometimes it'll make the cut. However, it is definitely a great build around, and even if you can only consistently have 1 other wizard in play, this gets a lot better. Obviously, you want as many in play as possible, but the point is, this is an excellent wizard payoff and build around, and in a deck that got there on wizards, it's basically Flame Tongue Kavu, or if you want a more recent example, Sand Strangler. So I think it's a B in your wizard decks, one of the best payoffs around for being in it. It has such a high ceiling that maybe in some weaker pack 1 pick 1 scenarios you consider taking it and see if wizards are open, but most of the time I'd steer clear until a little bit later in the pack or until it's clear that you're going to be getting a decent number of wizards. Next up, we have the first Eruption, which for 2 generic and a red is a rare enchantment saga, and this is a new card subtype where when you play it, it gets a counter added to it, a lore counter, and that gives you Chapter 1, represented by Roman numeral 1 here. And then every other turn after your draw step, it gets another lore counter. You go to the next chapter, and after the 3rd chapter, you sacrifice it. This one, Chapter 1, does 1 damage to each creature without flying, so it does that immediately when you cast it. Chapter 2 adds 2 red mana to your mana pool. And Chapter 3 says sacrifice a mountain. If you do, the first Eruption deals 3 damage to each creature. I don't like this a ton. I want to. You know, when I first saw it, I thought it would be good, but the more I think about it, it kind of lets me down. Doing 1 to each creature without flying might matter, but it frequently won't. Obviously, this is better against opponents with X1s in play. Chapter 2, adding red is a nice bit of ramping and maybe lets you power out a big creature a little earlier, which can be nice. But it has to have more than 3 toughness because of Chapter 3, which will kill all the small creatures on the board if you give up a mountain. So the ideal way for this to go down is to kill at least one of your opponent's creatures with Chapter 1, to power out something with more than 3 toughness in Chapter 2, and then to blow up mostly only your opponent's creatures with Chapter 3. When that happens, it'll feel good. The problem is, most of that just isn't stuff you can control, and if you are telegraphing this all to your opponent, which you will be, they can also just play a creature with more than 3 toughness and not worry, and it's not that hard to do that on turn 4 and 5. Sure, sometimes they won't be able to do it, but in that case, they will just wait to play it. This thing is kind of underwhelming to me, and I see myself thinking of it more as something to bring out of my sideboard against decks that are really low to the ground, where Chapter 1 and 3 will both blow up a lot of stuff. For now, I'm going to give it a C-. I could see it maybe being a little bit better in like a really controlling red deck where none of your creatures or very few of them die to Chapter 3. But most red decks in this format, like in most formats, look like they want to be reasonably aggressive. So, you know, this card is hard to judge. All the sagas are hard to judge, I think. And I'm going to give this a try early so I can see what's going on. And you know, maybe it's better than I think it is, but I don't think it, you know, I'm not saying it's unplayable. I'm just saying maybe it's better out of your sideboard and main board. I think it's going to underachieve. Like, it looks like it does cool stuff, but I just don't think it'll get there. Next, we have the Flame of Keld, which is another saga, and this one is uncommon. It's 1 generic and a red, and Chapter 1 says, discard your hand. Chapter 2, draw 2 cards, okay. And Chapter 3, if a red source you control would deal damage to a permanent or player this turn, it deals that much damage plus 2 to that permanent or player instead. I like this one a little bit more, actually, but more as the last card out of your hand. It basically works like Tormenting Voice does in some formats, except that you can cast this with 0 cards in hand, and that's going to be the best time to cast it. Then on your next turn, you get 2 extra cards, which is pretty nice. And the turn after that, your red stuff does 2 more damage. I think Chapter 2 is really where the value is here, especially for a card that only costs 1 in a red. I think I like the idea of running this in basically any red deck, but especially more aggressive ones where you will run out of cards quickly as you build up your board. This makes sure you have some extra gas with the extra cards, and it is nice that it inflicts a little bit of extra damage too, or at least it can. That's kind of a downside about this one. Chapter 3 may do basically nothing. But I'm going to give this about the grade I would give like Tormenting Voice, which is like a solid C. You'll run this in a red deck, but it isn't a card you're going to really go after in most cases, I don't think. But, you know, I don't mind having this in my aggressive red deck, playing it after I run out of gas, and then you're going to be in pretty good shape. Next, we have Frenzied Rage, which for 1 generic and 1 red is an enchant creature, an enchantment aura, that is, at common. And enchanted creature gets +2/+1 and has Menace. This aura gives a nice stats boost and evasion for an efficient cost, but it has a problem all auras have. It opens you up to a lot of risk for a 2-for-1 if your opponent can take down your creature. Auras like this one are swingy, as you likely win the game in cases where your opponent doesn't blow it up and lose the game when they do. That said, red-white has some nice synergies for auras and equipment, including not letting them go to the graveyard with your creature, you get it back in your hand and things like that, and it will certainly be better there and keep you from getting 2-for-1. And in any red deck that's aggressive, it'll be pretty good, but I'm not going to feel good about it unless my deck has some synergies. Even then, though, it probably caps out at like a C- or a C. It's not incredible, but, it'll get the job done. I know I'm going to lose to it, at least, in this format at some point, because it does make a scary creature a lot scarier, and that could be a problem. Next, we have Gitu Chronicler, which for 1 generic and 1 red is a 1/3 human wizard at common. It has kicker of 3 generic and a red, and when it enters the battlefield, if you kicked it, you get to return target instant or sorcery card from your graveyard to your hand. I like this cycle of commons that have kicker costs that give you additional value. They're all fine if you have to play them in the earlier part of the game as blockers or attackers, and in the late game they do some pretty nice stuff for you. Look at it this way, a 6-mana 1/3 that returns an instant or sorcery from your graveyard certainly wouldn't be a good card, but it isn't a terrible one either. Basically, this can be 2 different mediocre cards, a 2-mana 1/3 or a 6-mana 1/3 that gives you back a removal spell, and that flexibility is nice. Also, this is a wizard, and that comes up occasionally in this format, especially because it also likes instants and sorceries, so the blue-red deck will really like this card. It's both a wizard, and it likes instants and sorceries, and that's what blue-red is about. Don't mistake all my enthusiasm for this card in this cycle to mean the cards in it are incredible or anything. They're not. They're all just fine, and in most cases, they'll make your deck, but sometimes you'll cut them. I think this guy's a solid C, though. Next, we have Gitu Journey Mage, which for 2 generic and a red is a 3/2 human wizard at common, and when it enters the battlefield, if you control another wizard, it does 2 damage to each opponent. Here we have a much less interesting wizard payoff than the awesome Fire Fist Adept. Don't get me wrong, doing 2 to your opponent when it comes into play is nice, but it isn't great. 3 mana for a 3/2 worth of stats isn't special. It does benefit from itself also being a wizard, so it can help make cards like Fire Fist Adept better, but on the face of it, it's a pretty mediocre card, even when you account for potential upside. It's a D in a deck that doesn't have a decent number of wizards in it, where you can consistently do the 2 damage, and probably a C in a deck that can consistently do the 2 damage. You'll play it in your wizard decks, but you probably won't play it anywhere else. Next, we have Gitu Lava Runner, which for 1 red is a human wizard at common. It's a 1/2, and it says as long as there are 2 or more instant and or sorcery cards in your graveyard, it gets +1/+0 and has haste. This isn't going to be very good in Limited. It isn't worth it when it is a 1-mana 1/2, and by the time you have 2 instants and sorceries in your graveyard, it will likely be past the time when a 2/2 with haste is going to matter. It's an F in most decks, and I guess a D in spells decks. It's not even really worth playing there. This is a card that's going to have a lot more potential in Constructed, where it can very consistently basically be Goblin Guy, but that's very hard to do in Limited. It's just going to be too late in the game by the time you have the spells in your graveyard to make him better. Next, we have Goblin Barrage, which for 3 generic and a red is an uncommon sorcery, and it has kicker, sacrifice an artifact, or a goblin. There's one of the few goblin synergies that is around here. And it does 4 damage to a creature, and if the spell was kicked, it also does 4 damage to target player or planeswalker. This is a good removal spell. 4 mana to do 4 to something at sorcery speed isn't incredible, but it gets the job done fairly efficiently. The addition of a kicker that doesn't actually cost mana is nice, and getting to lava axe your opponent while you kill their creature is going to feel good. Not all decks will have enough goblins and or artifacts to pay for that kicker, but most decks in red are going to have at least a few goblins and at least a few artifacts. Just those are things that are just running around. But I'm going to give it a C+ in a deck where, like, you can't consistently kick this, and a B- in a deck where you consistently can. It's a good removal spell. I think it's probably like borderline first pickable in a weaker pack. It's not as good as some of the other red removal spells we've seen and will see, but it's pretty good. And you'll play it, and you'll always play it basically, and sometimes it'll be first pickable. That's what I'm trying to say. Next, we have Goblin Chain Whirler, which costs 3 red mana, is a Goblin Warrior at rare, and a 3/3 with First Strike, and when it enters the battlefield, it does 1 damage to each opponent and each creature and planeswalker they control. Now we arrive at the red card in the cycle of 3 mana creatures who all cost 3 colored mana, and like the rest, it is obviously quite powerful if you can cast it. This can wipe out small creatures, ping the opponent, and has a pretty great 3-mana 3/3 First Strike body. But I think you basically only want to play this guy in a mono red, or at least like a deck with 12 red sources. Like all the cards in the cycle, they did a good job designing them. They're good even if you can't cast them on turn 3, other than the black one, and stay relevant all game long, again, other than the black one. In this case, it is thanks to having First Strike, meaning it can attack on lots of late games and also block well, and in the process it also wipes out small creatures. So yeah, ideally you drop this guy in turn 3, but if you can, it's not the end of the world. But because of that mana requirement, I don't think I ever want to go after him first pick, because it is just too hard to guarantee that red will be open enough that I can make this guy work. And he's not so strong that I should force a subpar mono red deck just so I can play him. I'm going to give him a C+, with the obvious caveat that if you're deep into a heavy deck, a heavy red deck, when you see him, you should grab him immediately. He'll be significantly better than a C+ in the decks that can play him consistently on turn 3 or 4. Next up, we have Goblin Warchief, which for 1 generic and 2 red is a 2/2 Goblin Warrior at uncommon. He says goblin spells you cast cost 1 less to cast, and goblins you control have haste. This guy is a reprint, and last time we saw him in Onslaught block, I think in Onslaught itself actually, it was ridiculous. Not only in Limited, but in Constructed, it spawned an entire Goblin deck in Constructed, and there were a million goblins in that Limited format. Sadly, there aren't that many goblins in this format. When this got spoiled, I thought, hey, you know, maybe they're actually really going to be pushing a mono-red goblin deck in this format. That would be an interesting change. And, you know, the Blade Whirler guy was spoiled too, and I was like, you know, maybe that's it. But in the end, there's like 4 goblins at uncommon rarity or lower, and that's nowhere near enough to support him in most cases. Now, you can still really make him good. You're going to need some rares for some help, and we're going to see some rare goblins, or at least 1 rare goblin coming up. But he's just not going to have friends often enough for him to be that good. So he's basically going to be a 3-mana 2/2 with haste most of the time. And it really hurts me to say this, but that means he's like a D in Limited. I will give you the caveat of in the world where you end up with like an 11 goblin deck somehow, he's like a B+, but that's just it. It's not going to happen. And I'm really sad about that, because I thought goblins were going to be a thing. But as you'll see, as we continue throughout Red, there really aren't that many goblins. So, you know, Goblin Warchief, probably going to be great in Constructed again. They printed a bunch of good goblins. There's good goblins in Ixalan, so be on the lookout for goblins in Standard and maybe even Modern, because he hasn't even been legal in Modern ever. So, you know, he's going to be impactful everywhere else, not so much here in Limited, sadly. Next up, we have Haphazard Bombardment, which for 5 generic and a red is a rare enchantment, and this one is a very interesting design. When it enters a battlefield, you choose 4 non-enchantment permanents you don't control and put an aim counter on each of them. Then, at the beginning of your instep, if 2 or more permanents you don't control have an aim counter on them, destroy one of those permanents at random. So this has an interesting design, and that makes it kind of hard to evaluate it. With the randomness involved, it almost feels like a Hearthstone card. Anyway, I'm usually wrong about 10% or so of the cards in the set, and this has a good chance at being one of the cards I'm wrong about. With that caveat in mind, here's what I think of this. It seems solid. It costs 6 mana, which is a lot, but it does have an immediate impact on the board, since it kills one of your opponent's permanents at your instep. Sure, you can't control what permanent exactly, but the bombardment kills 3 permanents when all is said and done, and that's a 3-for-1. Sure, maybe their best permanent survives, but that is going to get a decent amount of value, even if you're just killing 3 of their 4 best permanents. It will hurt when you play this, put counters on your opponent's stuff, and then they play a permanent that is an even bigger problem, and that's going to suck. So despite always being a 3-for-1, it is too slow and random to be something you really want to first pick. Still, I do think it's playable and not a bad card for red decks that are interested in playing things that cost 6 mana. I'm going to give it a C+. And this card is so weird that I could see it being like a B+, or a D+ too. Like those are possibilities. It may be that it's so slow at killing the permanents you want to kill that it's just horrendous, or it could be that, you know, it actually, the 3-for-1 value you get out of it is enough to make it really good. We'll just have to see. It's definitely a cool card. Like the design, like the flavor. Let's move to the next card. Next, we have Jaya Ballard, who for 2 generic and 3 red is a legendary planeswalker, Jaya, at Mythic Rare. She starts with 5 loyalty. Her +1 loyalty ability adds 3 red mana to your mana pool, but you can only use it to cast instant or sorcery spells. Her +1 lets you discard up to 3 cards, then draw that many cards. And her -8 says you get an emblem with, you may cast instant and sorcery cards from your graveyard. If a card cast this way would be put into your graveyard, exile it instead, so basically it gets flashback. It's really cool to see Jaya Ballard again, but I have to say, her Planeswalker is pretty underwhelming for Limited. She can't protect herself, and that is always really important for Planeswalkers to be good at in Limited. They have to help add to your board presence somehow or come with some removal so that they can contribute to the board immediately. And she just doesn't. Sure, she basically enters with 6 loyalty, making her hard to take down in a turn, and her second +1 is actually pretty nice for helping you improve card quality. But her other 2 abilities are only going to be good in one place, instant and sorcery heavy decks. And while blue-red decks look to be the place for that, I honestly feel like there are better payoffs for that deck at much lower rarities. Add to that the fact that she isn't exactly easy to cast with the triple red requirement, and Jaya Ballard is really underwhelming as a Planeswalker for Limited. Don't get me wrong, if you're ahead, her ability to improve the quality of your draws is going to be good, but she's basically a Merfolk looter for 5 mana. Okay, she's a little better than that, I'm exaggerating. But the point is, she's only going to be good if you're ahead, and she's going to be okay if you're at parity. She can help pull you ahead, but if you're behind, she's going to be awful. I'm going to give her 2 grades because she's such a build-around. Like, if you're an instant and sorcery heavy deck, she certainly is better. I think in most Limited decks, she's a D, though. Like, on average, you're going to have, like, what, 4 or 5 instants and sorceries? And in that case, you're really only going to be using her middle ability ever. And that ability is good. It's her best ability, I think. But you know, her +1 and her -8 are really incentivizing you playing spells, and if you're not, she's not going to be that good. So I think she's a D in your average Limited deck and a C+ in a spells heavy deck. Don't go after her early, despite how cool she is. I mean, there is some chance she ends up being really good in Limited, in Constructed, and in that case, maybe she's worth something, and then maybe you should consider taking her for that reason. But in Limited, she's not going to be good enough. I mean, she's not going to be bad, but she's not going to be that good for the decks in Limited. Next, we have Jaya's Immolating Inferno, which for X and 2 red is a legendary sorcery at rare. And there's a cycle of these, and they all can only be cast if you have a legendary creature or planeswalker in play. And Jaya's Immolating Inferno deals X damage to each of up to 3 targets. This legendary sorcery is kind of a letdown. I like the first 3, the white one, the blue one, and the black one that I've looked at. I think I gave them all B+. And maybe those were a little generous. Some people have mentioned that in the comments. Maybe it's too hard to cast these. And maybe you're right, but the point is I don't like this one that much. Sure, if this was always a spell you could cast from your hand, that's one way to look at these. If this was something you could cast from your hand all the time without the legendary sorcery subtype, would it be great? And the answer here is, like, yeah, it would be pretty good. You know, if you think about pumping 5 mana into this and killing 3 toughness creatures, that's not bad. But it has diminishing returns. Once it gets to 7 mana and you're killing 3 5-mana creatures, 5 toughness creatures, I guess that's still pretty good. But you just have to jump through so many hoops for this, and the effect, while powerful, it doesn't feel like it's enough for a legendary sorcery. Like, the amount of work you have to go through, like this probably would be a B or a B+ if you could always cast it. Like, that would be pretty good, right? It would be that good, but you can't always cast it. So I think it's just a C in, like, because you're just not going to have sorceries all the time. Like, legendary creatures all the time, and that's kind of a problem. So it's good. I mean, you'll play it for sure in a deck where you have like 6 or 7 legendary creatures and or planeswalkers, and it'll be good. But it's just not the kind that you can take and say, okay, I'll pick up some legendary creatures because this is so powerful. At least that's how I feel about it. Next, we have Kelvin Overseer, who for 2 generic and a red is a 3/1 human warrior at common. He has Kicker for 3 generic and a red. He has haste, and when he enters the battlefield, if it was kicked, you gain control of target creature until end of turn. Untap it, it gains haste until end of turn. So basically, it's a threaten on a stick. Another creature with a super high kicker cost, Kelvin Overseer, either gives you a 3-mana 3/1 with haste or a 7-mana 3/1 that threatens something. Both options will be good at times, but neither half is something you jump for joy about either, as I continue to say about the common creatures with kicker. He's fine, and you'll probably play him in a lot of your red decks, but you're not going to be excited about it, and I think that means he's a C. Next, we have Kelvin Raider, who for 2 generic and 2 red is a 4/3 human warrior at common. When it enters the battlefield, you may discard a card. If you do, draw a card. So it lets you rummage. I like this card. A 4 mana 4/3 is pretty solid stats, and the ability to rummage when it comes into play is some nice additional upside. This helps you improve card quality, especially when you can discard a land to it. Between the good stats and the usefulness at all stages of the game, thanks to its rummage effect, I think this is a C+. Next, we have Kelvin War Caller, who for 1 generic into red is a 2/2 human warrior, and whenever it attacks, you put a lore counter on target saga you control. So this is something of a build around, obviously enough. A 2 mana 2/2 is like a D+, the kind of thing you'll play when you really need a 2-drop. However, if your deck has a few sagas in it, this value of this card does go up significantly. Adding a chapter to a saga means you get 2 chapters in a single turn, the turn you play it, and that's pretty nice. For example, if you play a saga, get the first chapter, attack with this, and get the second, that's going to feel pretty good. And not only that, it speeds you towards Chapter 3 of the saga a turn earlier, and that's significant because Chapter 3 on some of the sagas is usually incredibly powerful. I think the fact that it can add a lore counter to a saga is going to make chump attacking with this worth it, even in the late game if you have a saga in a play. So in a way, he's a 2-drop that is relevant even late. And he's relevant assuming you have sagas only. So if you have like 3 or more sagas, he's going to be something you feel fine about playing. I think that gets it to about a C+. I did note that neither of the red sagas impresses me greatly, but obviously your deck's not going to be mono red, and even the red sagas get better when you have Kelvin War Caller in play, obviously enough. So, you know, it's going to be good sometimes, but if you don't have a few sagas in your deck, it's probably not worth running. Next, we have Orcas Vandal, who from 1 generic into red is a 1/1 Orc Warrior at uncommon. You can tap it and sacrifice an artifact to have it do 2 damage to any target. I think this is another reprint, and it's also another build-around. He's terrible in a deck that's short on artifacts. He's going to be a lowly 2-mana 1/1. Maybe your typical deck in this format has, like, what, let's say, like 2 or 3 artifacts. And that's not going to be enough for him. He's basically just an F if you have that few artifacts. However, in a deck where it really gets there in artifacts with around 10, which is entirely possible in this format, there are a lot of artifacts. He turns into a very powerful card. He can be used to do the last few damage to your opponent or to start hurling your artifacts at your opponent's creatures to kill them. Both of those routes are pretty attractive, and in a deck that gets there in artifacts, I think he moves all the way up to a B-. Next, we have Radiating Lightning, which for 3 generic into red is a common instant, and it deals 3 damage to target player and 1 damage to each creature that player controls. This card isn't going to be that good on most board states. Sure, it can pick off a bunch of X1s, or if you go to combat and take your opponent's creatures down to their last damage, it can kill them. But a lot of the time, this is just going to be a very expensive lava spike. It gets helped a little by the fact that blue-red decks are interested in cramming as many instants and sorceries into their deck as possible. But still, even with Sapperling tokens and other X1s running around, I think this is the kind of card that you can mainboard if you're desperate. And if you do, it's like a D+. But out of your sideboard, I think it's significantly better. I think it's like a C+, especially if you're up against Sapperlings or another deck that's really low to the ground and has a lot of X1s. Yeah, so I wouldn't mainboard this in most cases unless I'm really desperate for spells or, yeah, that's about it really. And otherwise, I bring it out of my sideboard. Next, we have Rampaging Cyclops, which for 3 generic and a red is a 4/4 Cyclops at common. But when it gets blocked by 2 or more creatures, it gets -2, -0. This guy is a little weird in that he's a red creature who's actually asking you to be on defense. As a blocker, he is always a 4-mana 4/4, and that's pretty formidable. Not a lot of creatures can attack through that at the early stage of the game. As an attacker, though, he'll frequently shrink down to a 2/4, and that's not good at all. This means that 2 2/2s can block it and take him down, or worse, 2 2/3s. There's just going to be board states where you just can't attack with him, and they're not going to be that complex of board states. Sure, on an empty or almost empty board, he does hit really hard, but how often is the board going to be empty on turn 4? He really occupies an odd space for red decks since he's better on defense, and I think some red decks will like that. But I think the majority of decks would rather have a 4-drop that is actually worth attacking with, and I'm going to give him a C-. Next, we have Run Amok, which for 1 generic and a red is a common instant, and it says target attacking creature gets +3/+3 and gains trample until end of turn. I think this is red's best combat trick in the format. It gives a good stats boost for the cost, and adding trample to a combat trick can often be devastating, since in addition to running over one of your opponent's creatures, and with a trick like this, you'll sometimes get to run over 2, you also do damage to your opponent. But like all tricks, it has an inherent risk associated with it, and it's only good in aggro decks, especially this one, because only attacking creatures can benefit from it. So don't go out of your way to take it or anything. It's the kind of combat trick that'll wheel, and you'll play one of in your aggressive decks, and it'll cause some sweet blowouts, but you'll get 2 for 1 sometimes too. And I'm going to give it the grade I give all good tricks, which is a C. Next, we have Seismic Shift, which for 3 generic and a red is a common sorcery that says, destroy target land. Up to 2 target creatures can't block this turn. This doesn't seem very good to me. Blowing up lands in limited usually isn't very impactful, save for in cases when you blow up a powerful non-basic, of which this format has very few, or blow up a land providing someone with their splash color. This one does add that 2 creatures can't block, but this is basically 2 mediocre cards stapled together. I don't really want to play either of them in most cases. I could maybe see playing it in the most aggressive deck ever, as sort of the top curve to make sure you get through the last damage by making your opponent's 2 of their creatures anyway unable to block, so I won't completely disregard it, but I'm close to doing so, and I'm going to give it a D-. Next, we have Sivan Fire, which for 1 red is a common instant with a kicker of 4 generic mana, and it does 2 damage to target creature, and if it was kicked, it deals 4 damage to that creature instead. This is an incredibly efficient removal spell. Reminiscent of Burst Lightning, Sivan Fire is excellent because it can kill a small creature in the early game, fairly efficiently, and take down bigger things in the late game, a little less efficiently. And it does it all at instant speed. This is probably Red's best common in the set, and I think you first pick it in most packs. I'm giving it a B. Next up, we have Siege Gang Commander, which for 3 generic and 2 red is a 2/2 goblin at rare. When it enters the battlefield, you create 3 1/1 red goblin creature tokens, and you can pay 1 generic and a red to sacrifice a goblin, and Siege Gang Commander deals 2 damage to any target. We've seen this guy a couple times, originally in Onslaught block along with Goblin Warchief, and more recently in one of the core sets. I believe he was reprinted, and he was really good there. He's great. He's one of my favorite cards ever, but I'll try to put that bias aside. Good news is, he's excellent, so bias isn't going to make me fanboy over it too much more than it deserves, at least I don't think. Think of it this way. If this was a 5-mana 2/2 goblin that put 3 1/1 goblins into play, that would already be a really good card. That would be like a B. You're getting 4 bodies for 5 mana. But on top of the fact that it lets you go wide with a single card, it also lets you turn goblins into shocks for 2 mana. That allows for some serious reach. Even if your deck has 0 other goblins in it, the 4 bodies this provides means that if your opponent ever drops to 8, they're in trouble. And there are other goblins in this set, so it'll sometimes be able to do way more than that. So basically, this is Beetleback Chief on super steroids. It is 1 card that helps you go wide, and can turn goblins into removal or do the last damage to your opponent, and that's excellent. This is the kind of card that can get you back at parity from behind, pull you ahead if you're at parity, and seal the deal if you're ahead. And that means it's a bomb, and I'm going to give it the grade a bomb deserves, which is an A. It isn't even really a build-around because, like I said, it doesn't need other goblins to be great, though they certainly do make it even better. And if you have Goblin Warchief in play and can play Siege Gang Commander in turn 4, that's going to be really gross. But unlike the Warchief, this is actually still super good because it doesn't need any help to be good from other goblins. You should first pick this almost any time you see it. Next, we have Skirk Prospector, 1 red mana for a 1/1 goblin. Oh, there's another one at common. And you can sacrifice a goblin to add red mana. Another goblin that they spoiled relatively early that is from Onslaught block and was another card that got me really excited for goblins. But again, there aren't that many of them around, but this is one of them. Like Siege Gang Commander, this one's fine without any goblin friends. It can help you ramp into a 3-drop on turn 2 after getting in for a damage, and that's not terrible. Obviously, he gets better in a deck with more goblins because you can do insane things with mana, but the goblin support in this set, while present, isn't such that you will frequently be able to get a ton out of the Prospector. A lot of those goblins you don't want to be sacrificing either since they have good stats. But, you know, if it's going to ramp you into a Siege Gang Commander or something, then you should probably do it. But I'm going to give him a C. I'm not really going to give him a build-around grade. It's good on its own, and it's not going to be that much better because there aren't that many goblins running around. Next, we have Skizik, which for 3 generic and a red is a 5/3 elemental at uncommon. It has a kicker of 1 red mana. It has trample, it has haste, and at the beginning of the instep, if it wasn't kicked, you sacrifice it. This is another reprint, a 3rd one in a row. This one's from Invasion block. It was so good back in the day in Invasion block that it saw constructed play, and that tells you a lot about power creep because now this guy isn't anything great. We just had Charging Monster Sword. Sort of compare those 2 cards, and you'll see that there's a massive difference between them. That said, I don't think it's bad. In fact, I think he's a nice top of the curve for aggressive decks, but he isn't great either. If you can't pay the kicker, you basically have the world's worst ball lightning, so most of the time, unless it's going to finish off your opponent, I think you want to play this with the kicker, where it will frequently be able to bash in for 5, and then next turn your opponent has to keep their shields up or risk being hit really hard again. Still, 5 for a 5/3 with trample and haste is solid stats, but not anything really exciting. I'm going to give it a C+. Next, we have Squeezy Immortal. He's back. 1 generic and 2 red for a 2/1 legendary creature Goblin at rare, and you may cast Squeezy Immortal from your graveyard or from exile. I feel like this is a card people will underrate in Limited. I mean, how good can a 3-mana 2/1 that never dies be? Well, the answer is that he's actually pretty good. Sure, he doesn't hit hard or anything, but he can constantly trade for X2s, attack recklessly and relentlessly, which your opponent will sometimes just have to take because of the threat of combat tricks, and in a worst-case scenario, he can just chump block a big monster all day long. And can you imagine comboing this with Siege Gang Commander? This version of Squee isn't that much unlike the original one, as he essentially returns to your hand every time he dies, as when he is in exile or your graveyard, he's basically just an extension of your hand. He's a real nuisance, and in most cases, isn't going to win the game on his own, but your opponent is really going to groan if they have a 2/2 in play, and you play this on turn 3. It's just frustrating, and he will bring you a ton of value over the course of a game. He's a solid B, first pickable in a lot of packs, because his resilience is that valuable. Next, we have Two-Headed Giant, which for 2 generic and 2 red is a 4/4 giant warrior at rare. And whenever it attacks, you flip 2 coins. That's right, 2 coins. If both coins come up heads, Two-Headed Giant gains double strike until end of turn. If both coins come up tails, Two-Headed Giant gains menace until end of turn. This is yet another very cool and flavorful design. Wizards really killed it in this set in so many ways. But anyway, back to the card here. 4 mana 4/4 is doing well on the vanilla test, especially in red, where you usually get 4/3 for that mana, and the additional upside this brings is great. If you can get the 2 heads of your giant to agree one way or another, you get a powerful keyword ability in either menace or double strike. Both make this giant difficult to block, and one of them makes it hit super hard if your opponent can't block it. I haven't done the math here, but I feel like about half the time it won't get either of those keyword abilities, and it is sort of annoying attacking as a 4/4, flipping 2 coins and covering your eyes and hoping things go your way. But at the heart of this is still a 4 mana 4/4 with serious upside. Also worth mentioning that if you have tricks, auras, or equipment to enhance him, he's going to be pretty happy, since it will both make it easier for him to attack on boards where he misses out on the coin flips, and make him much scarier when he gets one of those. I don't think I want to first pick this guy because of how erratic it can be, so I'm going to give it a C+, although I could maybe see this overperforming. How often do we see a card where you flip 2 coins and crazy things happen? Not very often, so I could see him being a B- or a B, but for now I'm going to have him at C+. Next, we have Valda, Keeper of the Flame, who for 2 generic and 1 red is a 3/2 legendary creature, human shaman at uncommon. At the beginning of combat on your turn, for each aura and equipment attached to him, create a 3/1 red elemental creature token with trample and haste. Exile those tokens at the beginning of the next end step. This guy is obviously built around, but the good news is that a 3 mana 3/2 that triggers various historic and legendary things isn't abysmal. He's probably a D+ in a deck that has 0 auras or equipment, just absolutely 0. So he has a reasonable floor, like he's playable. You know, you don't want to be playing him, but he's playable, has a reasonable floor. He's not just a straight up F. But once you end up in a deck that wants to be running a lot of auras and equipment, he gets to be a lot better, and actually can just be a straight up win condition for the deck, as a free spark elemental or 2 every turn can really turn the tide of a game. I think he's one of the best payoffs there is for the aura and equipment deck, which will most of the time be red-white. And he's just going to be a solid B there. I don't think I love the idea of first picking him or anything, since his floor is sort of low, but at least he's still playable in a world where the aura equipment deck doesn't pan out. So taking him like pack 3 or 4 and seeing what's going on, pick 3 or 4 and seeing what's going on, seems pretty reasonable to me. Next, we have Varric's Bladewing, who for 2 generic and 2 red is a legendary creature dragon at mythic rare. It's a 4/4, it has kicker for 3 generic, it has flying, and when it enters the battlefield, if you kicked it, you create Karok's Bladewing, a legendary 4/4 red dragon creature token with flying. This guy's silly. A 4 mana 4/4 flyer on its own would probably already be a B. Those stats aren't stats we see a lot. But if you want to pay 7 mana, you basically get to cast Broodmate Dragon, and that's just frightening. The late game upside this guy can bring, and the fact that he won't be stranded in your hand if you just can't get to 7 mana, makes him an absolute bomb, and the kind of card you should pretty much always first pick. He gets an A from me. Next, we have Warcry Phoenix, which for 3 generic and a red is a 2/2 Phoenix at uncommon with flying and haste, and as all Phoenixes do, he comes back from the graveyard. In this case, when you attack with 3 or more creatures, you may pay 2 generic and 1 red. If you do, return it to the battlefield, tapped and attacking from your graveyard. A 4-mana 2/2 with haste and flying isn't bad, and would probably already be like a D+ or a C-, but adding the ability to come back from the graveyard is good. The fact it comes back attacking has both positives and negatives. The fact it comes in and does 2 damage immediately is pretty nice. The fact that you can't just keep bringing it back to block when that is the optimal situation is a bit of a downside. Still, this card's going to be good in a deck with 15 or more creatures that are interested in turning their guys sideways, and that's what red usually wants to do, so I'm going to give this a C+. Next, we have Warlords Fury, which for 1 red mana is a common sorcery. It says creatures you control gain first strike until end of turn. Draw a card. Note, by the way, that this is a sorcery. It's the kind of card people will assume is an instant without paying attention to the card type, since if it were an instant, it would actually be a combat trick, and this sort of feels like a combat trick. Instead, though, it gives your guys first strike at sorcery speed, meaning your opponent is well aware of it when you attack. That, on its own, would probably be an F, but between the fact that it replaces itself and the presence of a deck that is interested in casting lots of spells, I think this is actually somewhat playable. And I mean, sometimes the first strike will matter. It will make blocking your creatures uncomfortable for your opponent. Still, I think you cut this more than you played, and I'm going to give it a D. Next, we have Wizard's Lightning, which for 2 generic into red is an instant at uncommon, and it says it costs 2 less to cast if you control a wizard, and it does 3 damage to any target. This card's great. I mean, at worst, it's Open Fire, which was a great card in its limited format, and in general, a 3 mana to do 3 to a creature or player at instant speed is a pretty good limited card. It can deal with a lot of creatures and can do it at instant speed, which can enable blowouts, and it can even finish off opponents in a pinch. While this is a build-around, it doesn't exactly have a low floor. In a deck with 0 wizards, it is still really good, probably a B-. In a deck with a decent number of wizards, it shoots all the way up to B+, heck, maybe even an A-, since it basically becomes Lightning Bolt. On top of all that, wizard decks are really into instants and sorceries in this format, so it extra synergizes with the wizard deck. While this pays you off for having wizards, it is definitely worth spending your first pick on, since even its floor is a card you never cut from your deck and you are indeed happy to have in your deck. That is the last red card in Dominaria. One thing you may have noticed is that red has a ridiculous number of good removal spells at uncommon and common. I don't know if I remember a limited format where there were quite so many of them. The good news is I think 3 of them are uncommon and only 1 of them's common, but still, that's some good removal. I'll be back tomorrow continuing my full set limited review with green. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch the rest of my limited review and some draft videos of Dominaria within the next week or so, don't forget to subscribe. Thanks for watching.